And then after that, I've got a series of questions which I'm just going to kind of throw out and respond if you feel motivated, but don't feel that you have to have an answer for everything. And as it carries on, probably there'll be a number of the audience.
Hi Mike.
Hi John.
Hi Ian.
Do you all know each other?
Yeah, how are you?
Yeah. Just that.
Hi, okay. That's really good. Okay, we can hear you. You can't hear us. So I'm trying to get to another way in order to picture the word. So down at the bottom of the screen, the bottom left, there's a microphone icon.
So you Zoom is great.
Yeah?
In terms of quality of
You got Zoom open, yeah? Zoom playing, yeah? Okay,
it's starting to just have to see.
So down at the bottom, you got matches that
Sorry, after all this.
Okay, I'll turn the volume up on these microphones.
They're on, but they're not many people trying to come in live, but they'll watch it afterwards.
If they see that message, they know it's kind of crap, then they can come back and I'll leave it going anyway. It's a bit.
Is that better? Hold on. Is that better?
I can hear you.
Right, good. Excellent.
Thank you.
Great.
Can you turn Trevor just up a little bit, because I can't actually see him very well from here, so he can cut in effectively when he needs to.
That's as loud as I can get.
Okay, great.
Maybe not. Trevor, can you just speak a few words for us so I can get a level off you?
Okay, I can see all of you beautiful folk there.
Hi, Trevor.
I can see all of you. I can see Laurence.
Great.
Yeah. So are you good? Are you ready to go?
I think we are. I think we are. That's fine. That's fine. Okay, so let's start. Thanks for your patience, and we hope this technology still works. So I'm not totally sure who suggested that we do this, but it was clearly the thing to do. Jane McAlevey, who can't be here, was very much involved in trying to organise this, and we were very much hoping as well to have Titi Bhattacharya, who can't be here. But we do have, by Skype from Johannesburg? Is it? Where are you at the moment, Trevor? From Joburg. Trevor Ngwane. We've got Mike Tyldesley, Ian Allinson, Madelaine Moore, John Krinsky and Gareth Dale, all really to celebrate Colin Barker's life and work, which seemed to be a very appropriate thing to do, given Colin's key role in this conference in its previous 23 iterations. It's very weird to be here without Colin. I was saying to somebody else, I keep on seeing the back of somebody's head and thinking, oh, there's Colin, and then it's not. So it's fine for this to be a sad event, but it doesn't need to be solemn. Colin's funeral and wake was anything other than solemn, and Colin himself was not a particularly solemn or po-faced individual. So there is no need to do it in tones of hushed respect. So the way we're going to do this is as follows, technology permitting. First, Mike's going to talk about Colin and alternative futures, so the history of this conference, how we got here, and his relationship to Colin there. Then we're going to have a round table. I've got a series of questions to ask the panellists here, and we very much welcome as well responses from the audience if you've got things you want to say on those points. And we imagine that gradually, as in Colin's practice generally, the initiative would pass from the table to the room. So that's our hope. We've got plenty time. We're here, if we need to, till 6 o'clock, so we're under no pressure.
Could you introduce yourself? Not all of us know everybody.
Sorry, I'm Laurence Cox, apologies. Yeah, and I should say, some people are totally new to this conference. Not everybody here is an academic. Conversely, not everybody here is an activist, so it's quite a big space in that respect. Okay, so Mike, if I hand over to you.
Yeah. Right, I hope you can you all hear me? Yeah. Okay, my name's Mike Tyldesley. I was well, basically, along with Colin, I was one of the people who started the conference. What I want to do is talk to you about the very early years, how the conference became what it was really for many years in its period at Manchester Metropolitan University. The conference started, as some of you should know, in 1995. Basically, from 1996, and I'll indicate why this is the case. The conference really was basically Colin, myself, a bit of help at the start from conference office at MMU, a bit of help at the end, a lot of help at the end actually, from the conference office. There was a guy called James Charnock who I really wanted to mention because he helped us a lot, I think, in the latter period. We occasionally had some graduate students doing a bit of work with us, but broadly speaking, from 1996 to 2018, the team was Colin and myself. As I've said, it started in 1995. Now this, just as a bit of sort of background, this was an interesting time at Manchester Met University. In 1992, what had been Manchester Polytechnic became Manchester Met University. Colin had been at Manchester Poly for a very long time. I'd been there since 1990. In 1994, the department that Colin and myself were both in up till that point, the Department of Social Sciences, split, and we moved to having a Department of Sociology that Colin was in and a Department of Politics that I was in. That might have been a factor at the back of Colin's mind in wanting to have some sort of interdisciplinary working. That's something that we can perhaps think about. The original team in 1995 was actually Colin, myself, Paul Kennedy, who was a sociologist, mainly studying global studies, and Nev Kirk, who was a historian, a Labour historian. I spoke at Colin's funeral and afterwards to Paul, and both of us were definitely of the opinion that the original idea for the conference was Colin's. I don't think there's much doubt about that. So we started to meet, to discuss, and to plan for a conference. I recall a lot of meetings in a very dark and dismal coffee bar in the old Chatham building at Manchester Met University. For a number of reasons, and I don't have time to go into them, although some of them are quite funny. For a number of reasons, I'm fairly sure that we were actually starting to discuss this in some detail in the 1993-94 academic year. It would be sort of after Easter '94, we started to really talk about the conference and our ideas for it. So let's go back to that conference in 1995, the very first of the Alternative Futures Conference. And what I think is interesting is that we did a number of things that year that we never did again. And it was the sort of moves from what we did in 95 to what we did in 96 that I think helped make the conference the conference that it became. So what were those things? The first is we have plenaries. Well, we're here in a plenary today, and I recall, and I think it was about 2002, we did have a plenary. But basically from 96 to 2018, we didn't really have plenaries. Another way of thinking about that might be to call them keynote speakers. In some conferences you have keynote speakers. Well, we had two in 1995. We had Bert Clandemans from Amsterdam, and we had David Montgomery from the USA. But they were the last plenaries that we had, really. The second thing we did, and this is a really a bit of a strange one, but I was reading the notices that people had put up about Colin, and I noticed in Ian Birchall's comments on Colin that Colin had a lot of tapes from the Marxism events. So maybe this wasn't completely out of Colin's zone, as it were. But the thing we did in that, or one thing we did in that very first conference, was we taped all the sessions. I remember one of my jobs was to run around and make sure that all the chairs at the start of all the sessions had switched the cassette machines on. This was despite the fact that as we did all the way through, we asked for papers in advance. I think it was some sort of quality control for a book that actually appeared. Colin and Paul Kennedy edited a book, To Make Another World, I think it was called. And I think that the tapes were a form of quality control for that. Anyway, we never did that again, fortunately. The final thing we did that I've noted down that we didn't do again after the first one was we didn't use MMU accommodation. The only thing we ever got complaints about in the whole of the time that we were running the conference was the accommodation we used that first year. Something about people's feet dangling out the end of the beds or something like that. Anyway, Colin sent me to UMIST, to here, basically, and said, get something sorted out. I've heard they've got decent accommodation down there. So things started that way. So by 1996, what did we have? We had a conference that had no plenaries, that was basically multiple strand sessions going on. We had papers in advance. This was Colin's idea. There's no doubt about that. It was Colin's idea that you got the papers in advance. People sent, if somebody was presenting, they sent a paper in advance. I think it was genius, absolute genius, because it meant when you listen to a paper at the Alternative Futures, you don't have to scribble down stuff about the exact name of an author or the page of a quote that you're interested in or something like that. You can actually engage with the arguments that the speaker is making, and it's just struck me as such a good idea, and I've never been to any other conferences that do it. So no plenaries, papers in advance, accommodation at UMIST. We had the welcome desk at the start of the conference. I think you've got something a little bit like it this time. Colin had given them the sheets, and I think quite a lot of you here know what I'm talking about. But that's this. I thought that was terrific as well. I never knew another conference where the organisers actually sat and welcomed people. I think three things. Shifting slightly away from the things that we did, and particularly that Colin instigated, I think three things helped us tremendously. In sort of almost accidents, if you like, that helped us get the conference up and running in the form that it was in for that long period. These were, the first one was MMU opened the Manton building in 1996. I think that our second conference in 96 was actually still in the old Tilecoat building, which is now demolished. But once we were in the Mountain Building, we had our meals in the bistro, as they called it. We had the conference sessions would either be on the second floor or the third floor in contiguous rooms, where people who needed to maybe alter their paper at the last minute or whatever, but more particularly get an email, receive an email or send an email off. I think having everything in the Mountain Building for the conference from the sort of from that point of view, I think that helped it, and I think it gave it a bit of an identity and pulled it together. The second thing was the explosion around about that time of the use of internet and email in the academic world. I know for a fact that I'd never looked at the World Wide Web or whatever, and I'd never used email until 1995. I can date it. It was shortly after the first conference. But what I think was helped tremendously by the sort of the explosion of internet and email at that time was the international nature of the conference. It became so easy to maintain conversations with people over in different countries, in different continents. And that became, I think that rapidly became a very important part of the conference. And looking through the programme today, it remains that way. The third thing that I would mention as a sort of accident was the explosion of roads protests in Britain in the mid-90s. Why was that useful? Well, quite quickly after the start of the conference, we started to get largish numbers of papers at the conference about roads protests by academics who were often also involved in those protests. And so it didn't have to be the roads protests, that was just happenstance. But what happened was we got into a way of working around protests that were happening that I think was a tremendously important feature of the conference over the years. And so I'm going to end at that point. I think Alternative Futures very rapidly after 1995 became what it sort of continued to be up till 2018 and hopefully beyond. I think it was a conference with a difference. I think the way it was structured and the way that papers had to be given in advance gave it a very particular feel. And last Tuesday morning I bumped into at Piccadilly Station in Manchester. It was intentional. I bumped into a couple of Croatian sociologists who a few years back had been to this conference, and they were full of basically they were saying to us, this conference, Alternative Futures, it's so different to so many of the other conferences. It's friendly, you get good feedback, people are involved and people will talk to you. I think that Alternative Futures 95 to 2018 stands as a memorial to the work that Colin put into it. And it's something that I'm proud to have contributed to in that respect. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I don't know, do I need to be a bit closer to this to be heard? Is that about the right kind of volume? Okay. So the first question I wanted to throw out to the panel, and then after them anybody else who wants to comment, is just how people first met Colin, or when you ran into him and why.
Okay.
Go for it.
I think I'm probably the person who knows him the least long time, because I met him here a few years ago, and it was my first ever conference as a PhD student at a time when I was lacking confidence in anything I was doing, and I was just feeling very lost. And I'd read the edited volume that you've all contributed to, and that helped me have a language to say what I was trying to do with my project. And then meeting Colin and how welcoming and friendly he was, and open to discussing those concepts with a first-year PhD student who he'd never met before, actually gave me the confidence to use that language. And so I think ever since then he's kind of continued in that role in my work. And I was saying to Laurence before, every time I feel a little bit unsure about something I'm writing, I can go back to his website and he'll have written something. Which is a bit annoying because you want to be new and inventive, but it also gives you a confidence that you're on the right track. So
I'm Ian Allinson. I guess first met Colin in the late 80s when I got involved with the Socialist Workers' Party in Manchester, and Colin was very much part of the kind of landscape of the left in the city. He was always a good speaker, as I'm sure most people here know, and incredibly friendly. But I was never in the same branch as Colin. Manchester had a number of different branches, never really got to know him that well, I guess, until around 2013 when the rape crisis exploded in the SWP, and then working together to try and get a new organisation, RS21, Revolutionary Socialism in the 21st Century, up and running in the city. And Colin's contribution to that I think is just phenomenal, partly because he was one of those people who'd been through the experience of starting from nothing in building an organisation many years before, and he brought a kind of calm and confidence to that, when people were maybe panicking that things weren't going as well or as quickly as everyone hoped. And the extent to which he, I think, encouraged people and supported people, both politically and just in terms of his kind of kindness and hospitality. I think particularly, I was struck by what you were saying with young people, always incredibly keen to hear what they got to say and encourage them to develop their own thinking.
Okay.
It's not obligatory to say anything.
So I met Colin, I think similarly to Ian, in the late 80s when I was getting involved in SWP in Britain, and we'd recently seen the miners' strike, this extraordinary, almost civil war in Britain, involving, very different to the current civil war over Brexit, in that during the miners' strike it was very much along class lines, involving very dramatic, violent contestation, and our side was beaten. And for me, Colin was fascinating for me in the late 80s and early 90s, when partly through his incredibly rich and always brilliantly told anecdotes of industrial struggles in the 60s and 70s, and from those days gone by when shop stewards and factories could march into the manager's office, pull up a chair for themselves, put their feet on the table, and read out a list of demands for managers to accept, or to managers to implement. But it wasn't nostalgia simply. It was that Colin would then take stories like that and theorize them as in relationship to Marxist theory and to the world picture as a whole. For example, in this case, he talked about the work strength in workplaces as this, in a sense, as the cellular basis of the great social movements explosion of or one aspect of it, of the 1960s and 1970s. And so for me, he was the guy who kept those stories alive in a very vivid way and relate them to the present and to theorizing the overall development of capitalism in our day, and could always do so with such humor and such an incredible gift for storytelling.
I first met Colin in 1998 at a mini conference of the Collective Behavior and Social Movements section of the American Sociological Association. So that section has periodic mini conferences before the big annual convention. And this was, I think, the first one Colin went to, although he'd been in touch with some American sociologists of social movements for a few years before. And I didn't know that he was there, I didn't know who he was, but I went to a session, really, I think because one of my mentors was, I was a young graduate student at the time, and one of my mentors was on the panel, and so I went to this session, and this English guy was talking about the Liverpool dockers strike, and he was doing it in his inimitable Colin way, you know, telling stories and that had just the right point. There was humor, there was tragedy, there was drama. And I thought, this guy's amazing. I mean, first of all, I'd love to be able to tell a story this way, but this guy's amazing. And then it was lunchtime, and everybody in these conferences go their separate ways. And I was a graduate student, I had a friend or two there, but I didn't know a lot of people at the time. And here was this guy, and he was alone, and he didn't seem as if he had anybody to have lunch with. So my friend and I said, do you want to have lunch? And we did, and that was really, that was really how we met, and we got to talking, and we never stopped. And the next year I came to Alternative Futures. He told me about this conference, and I thought, okay, I'll go. This is interesting. And at that time, my department actually had money to pay for conferences, which my current university doesn't. And I came to this space. It was 99, so the conference was fairly young, and it was a place where, unlike a lot of American sociology of social movements, you could really be political. You could ask not just what this did for our analysis of this phenomenon, but what could this analysis do? What could the analysis of the phenomenon do for our futures and our collective futures? And it was a space where it was mind-blowing. I'd never been to a place where socialists and anarchists and communists could actually talk to each other. And they would argue with each other. And they would then have beers with each other. And there was something, just movingly beautiful about this space. And I kept coming back. And I think that first time was the first and last time. I also stayed in conference accommodation, and because Colin and I became quite close, and Aoife as well, and it was just one of those things where Colin's personality just sort of welcomed me in as if I was family.
Can I just jump in there? Can I?
Yeah, do.
Just to follow on from John on that. In the last session, Jeff Goodwin here was talking about Colin's interest in revolutions as deriving from his the fact that he's a revolutionary. And the conference, AFPP, always had something similar. It wasn't just a conference about social movement studies, it was a conference for people interested in and who do build social movements. Hence the spectrum of people that John mentions, who would always be at this conference, this great solidarity of everyone being on the left or broadly on the left, but so many different colours of the rainbow, the Stalinists and the Trotskyists and the Maoists and the Social Democrats and the left Social Democrats and the left Liberals and the Greens and and so on. Anarchists and autonomists, of course, I forget to mention them, and those who have a very clear political line but think that they don't, and so on. So it comes to all these people, and people who would normally, when you come across them in pubs after a demonstration, would be having it out and throwing buns at one another, and there's a purpose to that, but somehow AFPP was the space where you'd lay down your weapons for a few days and just have lunch. And Colin's, I don't know, Colin was a foodie, he loved food, and there was something about AFPP, the way it's arranged around meal times as well, this ritual of the meal times when people from all these different currents and positions and so on sit together and have very, very amicable and rich conversations about how to change the world.
Trevor, do you want to come in there?
Oh, okay, thank you. I met Colin in 2010 when he came over to Johannesburg for a workshop on social movements organized by the Center for Social Change at the University of Johannesburg. I had seen him previously in London because the period leading up to 2010, I used to attend the SWP Marxism event religiously. So I think I listened to him speak once or twice. But when he came to Johannesburg, we were in a game lodge, like a retreat. So we spent 2 to 3 days, and there was only about 18 of us. So we had quality time with Colin. So I remember that everyone was waiting for the great Colin Barker, and when you meet him, it's just Colin. So it was very great. And then I remember he presented a paper he had written with Laurence called "What Have the Romans Ever Done for Us?" And it was about movement theorizing against versus academic theorizing. And it came at a good time for me personally because after about 15, 20 years being a full-timer, an activist, I was doing my MA, so I was kind of grappling. I didn't know I was grappling with these issues in my mind. But, they came to light, listening to Colin, and, it set a firm basis for my engagement now because I teach at a university, I do research, but I'm trying hard also to maintain my activism. So that paper was a real good bridge for me. Hey, Colin was a great guy. I knew him that way, and then later I got to know him more as a revolutionary, as a member of SWP, and then later again as an organizer of the conference. So, it was a pleasure and an honor knowing a comrade like him. Thank you.
Do other people want to say things from the floor at this point about when you first ran into Colin? And plenty of time later as well. Yeah, somebody. Oh, hi.
My name.
The mic doesn't have to work.
It's a prop. Just imagine it works.
Should I try it? Yeah. So my name's Jeff Brown. I was a young IS member who came to Manchester in '72. My first memory of Colin was a smallish meeting, some kind of district meeting of sort of a committee, and there was a discussion. I can't remember what it was about, but I had my bright idea, and Colin basically said no, and explained why my idea really didn't fit. And then when he summed up, and it was a gentle summary, sort of enabled people to then move on. He said, "Okay, this, and this will happen," and Brown, shut up. And that was by Colin in such a lovely way that you couldn't. I still can tell the story without the slightest sense I was being put down or anything. It was just simply an appropriate way. I'd said something which was out of order, didn't make sense, and I should shut up. I still remember that lesson. There are people who feel I forget it. But I think more importantly, I want to talk about Colin as somebody who really had far too low a profile much of the time. I was in the mid to late 70s, the Anti-Nazi League organiser in Manchester, and we organised a whole lot of things, most notably a big carnival in Manchester which had 25,000 people at it. The thing is that the Anti-Nazi League was a national initiative. It required people to go about building both a united front from above and a united front from below. It meant going around talking to the MPs, talking to the footballers, talking to people with money who would help, talking a whole layer of people. It was Colin who did all that. Nobody really knows that Colin did that because he didn't talk about it. He just got on with it. And when the big, impressive list of all the sponsors of the Anti-Nazi League, which launched it as an organisation which had got sort of 60,000, 70,000 members in the course of about 12 months, it was Colin's work which had actually been done on the ground doing these endless phone calls to people who you really had to get on with, even if you didn't particularly agree with their politics. It was none of this sort of flashy stuff. In fact, when it came to the press conference, Colin was absolutely clear he wasn't going to do it. I actually did it appallingly. It was embarrassing, but nevertheless, that was Colin. Colin was not somebody ever to give a high profile to his activity, and I think it's important that we remember that. And in fact, we need to, in doing this, to dig out some of the stories, because Colin was the last person to ever blow his own trumpet.
Well, I'll tell mine and we'll move on and we can come back to more later. So I met Colin when we were both skiving off work. It happened politically in Ireland and was far too much in awe. We go to a session so they off and wound up sitting back around the pond talking about ducks. And then start to say, actually, we know a lot of activists who think rather more and rather better about social movements than this shower, don't we? So that was quite a really reaffirming experience, and very Colin as well, to have that sense of, he turned around to me at one point and said, I think Socialist Worker actually is a weekly newspaper of kind of organic intellectual work, which was maybe stretching it a little bit, but that kind of self-confidence of this stuff we do as activists, it's not somehow second-rate behind the proper, shiny, professional stuff. Often it's better. It just looks different. So on that note, I want to move on to the second question I flagged up for the panel, which is, in Colin's sort of political, intellectual theory, academic research, all of that, what should we be picking out and talking about? What should we name?
I can do it. I'm going to keep on starting them all. I'm going to start very broadly, but just, I think one of the things that I found so useful with Colin's work across all the many topics that he worked on was the openness and flexibility of his frameworks. You often come across a kind of dogmatic Marxism, and that was not at all what he was and what he worked with. It was, whenever we'd have these conversations, he'd be clear, and I remember my first presentation here, and I think you're in the audience who said this as well, of pulling us up and saying, where are the people? Because we were just talking about forces and abstract tendencies and whatever you do when you've just discovered this stuff. And then we came back and we worked on it and we're like, we're talking about social movements, we're talking about people, we're talking about messy things. And he was always adamant that as soon as your concepts seem too neat and your answers seem too neat, there's a problem. And that Marxism should be understood as a method that can continuously be living. It's not something that stays static and doesn't talk to and with its movements that it's operating with. And I think one other point on that kind of theoretical level was we felt its social consequences, and we didn't have, or we weren't using theory as activists at that point to really understand it in Melbourne. And it was so conscious of, we need to talk about theory and praxis as two sides of the same thing, and that are constantly in dialogue. And I think it's kind of a hard question to say that there's a politics and a theory and Colin as activist, because it's all one, and all of them sort of fed into the other.
Yeah, I think I've just looked around the room and I think I'm in the unique position. What should we celebrate of Colin's academic career? One of the things I'd like to say is what a great colleague he was. What a great colleague he was to work with. Just to give you an example, when I joined the Department of Social Science at Manchester Poly in 1990, we had a system, I think we were the only department that did, where we more or less timetabled ourselves, and we had a sort of, I think it was called the quartet, or it might have been the quintet, of people, senior colleagues, not members of management, but senior colleagues who dealt with it. And Colin, I think I'm right in saying this, Colin was a member of the quartet. He used to call it the Committee of Public Safety. You know, he was sort of one of the people you looked to when you joined the department. And just one memory. I mean, I've got a number of memories of Colin, and as a good colleague was when this was before we moved to the Manton building. I think they called them directors instead of vice chancellors in those days. The All Saints campus to the I think it was going to be to one of the campuses in the south of the city. I think it was going to be Elizabeth Gaskell, and we got him into a meeting. He was brought into a meeting, and I think after Colin had made his contribution, it was abundantly obvious to everybody in the room that we were not going to be moving to Elizabeth Gaskell, and that the rest of the meeting was simply about the director of the Polytechnic, Sir Kenneth Green was his name. It was about him finding ways to back down in the face of the overwhelming arguments that he'd just been faced with. And I have a number of memories. I just have a number of memories of Colin being such a staunch colleague.
I could jump in. Partially just to echo some of what was said already. That so Colin and I we did some work together on a number of different things over the course of the last 15 years or so. And I was first really interested in Colin's work through his interest in dialogical perspectives on sort of meaning creation in social movements. So the work that he used of Bakhtin and Voloshinov, and this whole perspective that also in the United States, represented by folks like Mark Steinberg, this idea that in the sort of social movement scholarship, that framing missed something, and what it missed was the actual dialogue. The actual dialogues that shape meaning, not just the projection of some meaning out there that other people could grasp or not. And so I was interested in that, and then through that, and through also some work of another scholar named Chick Collins, who was at the '99 AFPP. I guess he's a sociologist, but also linguist. He's quite interesting, his work. Anyway, he was also very interested in the work of Lev Vygotsky, who was a developmental psychologist in the early Soviet period. And as a way of sort of thinking about not just how do we make meaning dialogically, but then how do we learn? How do we learn to do things the way we do? How do we learn to organize the way we do? How do we learn to protest the way we do? And these questions of learning was something that we spoke a lot about and we wrote about. But I think that there's something sort of deeper than that, which is that I think Colin's interest in learning was one of the ways that he inoculated himself against any tendencies toward dogmatism. And he was very interested in connecting up theories of Marxism with theories of learning, but also to connect up theories of Marxism to work on the ground and theories of learning to work on the ground. And in this way, it was always, you always had the sense as well that his interest in learning, his interest in sort of how do we learn about our immediate surroundings, but then how do we scale up and learn about capitalism as a whole, or and these questions of levels of analysis were also, I think, something that Colin was really interested in, and this idea that if you're too sure about your answer, you're probably asking the question wrong. It also helped in the other way as well, which is if you get really stuck, maybe you're looking at the wrong level of abstraction. Maybe you can shift your analysis in a way to unstick you. And there was this really interesting sort of dialogue between very fine and very large scales, but also a real concern with what people really do when they try to change the world.
Can I come in? The only thing I think the only article I've ever really co-authored with Colin was on social movement theory. And most of you here are going to know him more as a social movement theorist. I mean, the conference he set up is on social movement theory, and several of the books he's written are on social movement theory. He's very well known as a social movement theorist. But I want to make a pitch for Colin as a state theorist. I think he was equally important in his state theory, but unfortunately his state theory exists more in the form of a whole bunch of brilliant but never ever quite really damn completed articles, and so we do need to fix that somehow. If anyone wants to look at them all and integrate them into a coherent whole, I think it will be a brilliant article. So Colin was typically iconoclastic in his state theory. You know, he just came out saying, you know, these guys who are the well-known Marxist state theorists, Miliband, Poulantzas, etc., it's completely wrong. And Marx himself, as we know, his theory of the state was seriously undeveloped. And what's wrong with Miliband and Poulantzas? They don't really look at the foundations of exclusion. And so Colin said about trying to develop a form analytic approach of coercive power within commodity society. Look, in other words, unlike previous systems in which the world's resources were divided according to various mixes of just direct appropriation, gift exchange, custom played a major role in some societies. Generalized commodity production, i.e. capitalism, it brings an entirely new world into being, a world based on commodity exchange, and that's usually the focus of Das Kapital, for example. But exchange, Colin argued, also implies exclusion. In other words, we're talking about the world of property and property fences, and so you have the right to your property is also the right to deny others access. So you have contradiction between your right and other people's needs. And Colin was drawing some of this. I think the way in which Colin set about developing this state theory was typical, really. He was immersed in the state capitalist tradition, the SWP's tradition of looking at Russia as bureaucratic state capitalism. But he was very interested in state theory of the 1970s, the German state debate, state derivationism, and so on. And he brought the two together. Those two were silos, no communication between the two. It was only Colin who, really, of the IS people who was reading the state derivation stuff, and only Colin in the state derivation camp who knew state capitalism theory, and he brought them together to come up with a very original theory of the state, one that attempts to explain the violence inherent in liberal capitalism, but developing it step by step from the commodity form, but also integrating it, and this is what the German state derivationists didn't manage to do, integrating it with the question of the plurality of states in the world system, which he was very attuned to through the idea of state capitalism, the competitive nature of state power in capitalism. And so he pointed out in an important article of the late 70s that Marxist state theorists had always been talking about the state as a singular, but you can't understand the state unless you understand it within the system of competitive geopolitical relations. And because Marxists hadn't grappled that, the door was left open to a revival of neo-Weberian state theory, which, you know, theorized interstate competition as fundamentally different to capitalist competition. And Colin's interest was developing a total theory of interstate and intercapital competition as a totality. And I think he did it brilliantly, and I haven't been able to, it's a very complex argument, I haven't been able to summarize it, obviously very neatly in just a couple of minutes, but it's there in a series of wonderful texts that are on his website and will be published in his collected writings, selected writings, I mean, within a year or so. Just to plug that.
John? Yeah.
Well, it's now a long time since I faced a class of students. It's getting on for 20 years, something like that. But I was a history teacher, and if I was doing it now, there is one book of Colin's which would be on the first year reading list, and we'd have a seminar on it. It's called The Festival of the Oppressed, which is the story of the Polish events. That is a fantastic history book. And if he hadn't been a sociologist, he would have been a great historian. Because in that book he uses sources, he uses oral history, and he uses, of course, his, if you like, his Marxist analysis. He brings it all together, but he tells a ripping good yarn. And I'll tell you one chapter which I've read more than once recently. It is where he analyses an institution which, to be honest, I don't think I've thought about very much, the Roman Catholic Church. And he puts his finger absolutely on the role of the church in Poland and its wobbles, the wobbles of the church. Colin phrased that, the wobbles of the church. So I laid out a marker for Colin as a historian, in addition to all the other things that are being said about him.
Trevor, do you want to come in there? Not obligatory.
Okay. It went a bit faint. I hope you can hear me.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. One thing Colin wrote about, which is of great interest,